The number that stopped me wasn't millions. It was 7. 7 distinct technological traditions, developed independently, across thousands of miles and thousands of years, that all vanished, not slowly, not through neglect, but at precise historical moments. And in every case, what replaced them served one function above every other: control. I spent weeks trying to understand why. What I found sitting in archives, in restricted institutional records, in footnotes that academics rarely read aloud, was a pattern so consistent it begins to feel less like coincidence and more like policy. Let me be fair to what we know. Civilizations rise and fall. Technologies are lost. The Library of Alexandria burned. Empires collapse and take their knowledge with them. This is the mainstream explanation, and it deserves a fair hearing before we interrogate it. The orthodox position is entropy, decay, conquest, simple forgetting. Historians have spent careers defending this view, and they are not wrong about the mechanics of collapse. But the mechanics of what came after, that's where the record gets strange. Act 1. The weight of what was replaced. There is a document sitting in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, dated approximately 1,200 years before what historians call the Common Era. It describes a hydraulic system, a network of underground water channels that ran for hundreds of miles beneath the Arabian Peninsula, requiring no pumps, no external energy source, only precise geometric calculation and an understanding of subsurface pressure gradients that modern engineers, when they have bothered to study these systems, have described as implausibly sophisticated. The document is a maintenance record, not an invention record, a maintenance record, which means by the time someone wrote it down, the system was already old enough to require upkeep, old enough to have generations of knowledge attached to it. The system is called the Khanate, and the part no one explains is why, when Khanate networks were operating across Persia, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula, some of them supplying entire cities with fresh water at zero energy cost, they were systematically abandoned, and the populations that had depended on them were reorganized around centralized water infrastructure that required payment, permission, and the approval of whoever controlled the distribution point. That's not technological regression. That's architectural replacement. The function stayed the same. The control structure changed entirely. This is the pattern. Not loss. Replacement. Act 2. The official story and its edges. The official story goes like this. Ancient technological achievements were remarkable for their time, but they were fragile, dependent on specific knowledge traditions, specific materials, specific geographical conditions. When those conditions changed through invasion, climate shift, trade disruption, the technologies became unworkable and were abandoned. What replaced them was more robust, more scalable, better adapted to changing social realities. Progress, in other words, is not always linear. Sometimes it curves back before it curves forward. This is a reasonable account. For some lost technologies, it is almost certainly correct. No one seriously argues that Roman concrete was deliberately suppressed. The recipe was probably genuinely lost, a victim of the administrative chaos following Rome's fragmentation. But I want to take you through 7 specific cases where the mainstream explanation begins to strain, where the timing is almost theatrical, where the replacement technology did not simply work differently, it worked in a way that specifically and measurably concentrated authority in fewer hands. I don't have answers, only patterns. But once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Act 3. The 7. Let's start with the numbers on the first technology. And the numbers here are almost rude in how obvious they are. The Khanate, which we have already met, fed an estimated 12 million people across the ancient Near East and North Africa by the 3rd century of the Common Era. Engineering surveys conducted in the 1970s by Iranian water authorities, buried in planning documents, not in mainstream historical literature, found that functional Khanate networks could, if properly maintained, supply the same populations today at roughly zero operational cost once constructed. The energy embedded in their initial construction would, by modern calculations, cost approximately $4 billion to replicate. Someone built that. Someone maintained it for centuries. And then, between roughly the 4th and 8th centuries, with remarkable consistency across geographically separate regions, central authorities began taxing water access, restricting Khanate construction, and reorganizing water distribution through official channels. The pattern indicator. The people who lost access to free water were not conquered by enemies. They were administered by successors. Speaking of administered systems, the second technology brings us to one of the most documented and least discussed suppressions in recorded history. Pre-colonial agricultural commons, practiced in forms recognizable across sub-Saharan Africa, the pre-contact Americas, and pre-enclosure Europe, were not primitive. They were sophisticated commons management systems, what contemporary economists now call common pool resource management, that maintained soil fertility, water access, and seed diversity across generations without private ownership and without central administrative control. The Iroquois Confederacy maintained agricultural commons across what is now New York State so stable that European observers in the 17th century described the soil productivity as superior to anything they had seen in England or France. What replaced them was the enclosure system in Europe, the reservation system in North America, the plantation system in Africa and the Caribbean. Different names, identical structure, the removal of community resource autonomy and the installation of a titling authority, a body with the power to grant or deny access to the means of survival. The timeline isn't subtle. In England, the major enclosure movements began within decades of the printing press, making it possible to systematically record and therefore challenge ownership claims. In the Americas, the destruction of agricultural commons systems coincided precisely with the establishment of colonial administrative courts. Which brings me to the third technology, and this one keeps me up at night in a different way than the others because the evidence here is not speculative. It is sitting in the Vatican archives, partially accessible to researchers since 1998, partially restricted until 2048. I am not making that up. The restriction date is 2048. Pre-Columbian medicinal knowledge systems in Central and South America represented, by even conservative ethnobotanical estimates, thousands of years of accumulated pharmaceutical research conducted through systematic observation, cross-generational documentation, and what we might now call clinical practice. The active compounds in plants used by Amazonian healers, compounds now being studied by pharmaceutical companies under patent applications, were known, named, and precisely dosed in indigenous knowledge traditions that were specifically and documented targeted for destruction. The Spanish colonial record is explicit about this. Inquisitional documents from the 16th century, archived at the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, describe the systematic confiscation and burning of medicinal codices not as collateral cultural damage, but as deliberate policy aimed at breaking the authority of indigenous healers. The reasoning, as articulated in those documents. Healers who could cure without the Church's intermediation represented a challenge to ecclesiastical authority over life and death. What replaced traditional medicinal commons was a physician licensing system, a model in which the authority to treat illness was granted by institutions, not inherited through community knowledge. The medicine itself was often inferior. The control structure was entirely the point. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But the documents are not speculative. They are in Seville. They have been partially transcribed. The reasoning is stated plainly by the people who wrote the orders. Moving to the fourth technology, we cross the Atlantic and the historical record becomes simultaneously more recent and more deliberately obscured. Nikola Tesla's atmospheric electrical system, and I want to be careful here because this case attracts a great deal of mythology that obscures what is actually documented, was not science fiction. The Wardenclyffe Tower, constructed on Long Island between 1901 and 1906, was a functioning prototype for wireless electrical transmission. Tesla's lab notebooks, now held at the Smithsonian, describe tests in which electrical current was transmitted through the Earth's ionosphere without wires over distances of several miles. J.P. Morgan, who had financed the project, withdrew funding in 1903. His stated reason was the impossibility of metering the electricity, of charging people for it. Morgan's correspondence, available through the Library of Congress, is explicit. A transmission system that could not be monitored and billed was commercially unworkable. This is not suppression mythology. This is a financier explaining in writing that a technology was abandoned because it could not generate revenue through controlled access. The tower was demolished in 1917. The patents were allowed to lapse. What replaced atmospheric transmission was the grid, a system requiring substations, distribution infrastructure, metering equipment, and a utility company standing between every electrical device and the energy source. The function was identical. The billing structure was entirely different. The fifth technology takes us to an archive that has been publicly available for decades and remains, I can only assume, unread by most people because its implications are too uncomfortable to sit with. The Roman road network is taught as a monument to engineering ambition. What is taught less often is that Roman roads were public infrastructure, legally accessible to any citizen, and that the maintenance and construction of those roads was funded through a system of public taxation that kept travel costs effectively zero for the movement of goods, people, and information. The speed of information transmission across the Roman Empire in the 1st century of the Common Era was not matched again in Europe until the telegraph in the 19th century. This is not a controversial claim. It is in Fernand Braudel's The Mediterranean, a foundational text in economic history, published in 1949. After Rome's administrative collapse, roads deteriorated. But here is what the mainstream narrative skips. The roads did not deteriorate uniformly. They deteriorated where they were not profitable to maintain. And what replaced them was a system of toll roads, river passage fees, and bridge taxes administered by feudal authorities, a system in which the movement of people and goods required payment to whoever controlled the passage point. The analogy to what happened to the internet between 1995 and 2010, moving from a commons-based network to a platform-mediated, monitored, and monetized one, I will leave for you to draw. The sixth technology is the one that generates the most academic resistance, which is itself an interesting data point. Pre-industrial seed commons, the practice of saving, sharing, and collectively developing crop varieties across farming communities, produced a genetic diversity in food crops that, according to a 1996 report from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, represented approximately 75% of agricultural genetic diversity that had been lost in the preceding century. The FAO report is not buried. It is publicly available. The number is 75%. 3/4 of the genetic variation in our food supply eliminated in 100 years. The mechanism of elimination was the seed patent, the legal transformation of a biological commons into intellectual property. The timing corresponds precisely to the industrialization of agriculture, beginning in earnest in the 1920s and accelerating through the Green Revolution of the 1960s. Seed saving, which had been not just permitted but structurally central to agricultural practice for 10,000 years, was progressively recategorized, first as inefficient, then as legally problematic where patented varieties were involved. What replaced the seed commons was a supply chain, a system in which the genetic basis of human food production passes through corporate ownership at the point of reproduction. The food still grows. The autonomy over its reproduction was transferred. And then there is the seventh, which is different from the others in one important way. The others involved the destruction or displacement of existing technologies. The seventh involves a technology that was not developed. Decentralized energy storage using the thermal mass of buildings, underground aquifers, and distributed thermal systems, a method of storing energy in physical media rather than chemical batteries, was understood in principle by Roman engineers, practiced in sophisticated forms by the builders of underground cities in Cappadocia, and theorized in mode. Act 4. The shape of the pattern. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but look at what is consistent across all seven. Each technology served a fundamental human need: water, food, medicine, energy, mobility, biological reproduction, communication. Each was organized in its original form around community access rather than individual purchase. Each was replaced, not always violently, not always immediately, but consistently, by a system that inserted an administrative or commercial intermediary between the human being and the resource. And in each case, the replacement system generated revenue specifically through that intermediation. The water utility, the enclosure deed, the physician's license, the electrical meter, the toll bridge, the seed patent, the battery manufacturer. That's not 7 separate stories. That's one story told in 7 registers. Maybe there is no coordinating hand. Maybe this is simply what happens when social systems optimize for extractable value, the way a river carves the path of least resistance, not because someone designed it, but because that is what water does. Maybe the pattern indicates nothing more sinister than the consistent behavior of capital when it encounters a commons. But here is what matters. Whether the mechanism is conspiracy or structural logic, the outcome is the same. And the outcome is documented in archives in Seville, in Washington, in Tehran, in Oxford. Act 5. What remains? The Canet networks are not all gone. Some still run. In Iran, in Oman, in parts of Morocco, communities maintain them. There are engineers in Tehran who have spent their careers documenting what remains, writing papers that appear in journals read by perhaps a few thousand people worldwide. Their work suggests that a network covering the same geographic scale as the original ancient systems could be rebuilt, could function, could supply water to millions of people at operational cost approaching zero. The seed commons are not entirely gone either. There are seed banks. There are farmers in Ecuador, in Ethiopia, in India, who still save varieties that predate the Green Revolution, who carry, in their practices, a living archive of 10,000 years of agricultural genetics. Organizations like Navdanya in India have spent decades documenting them. The archive is incomplete. It is shrinking, but it exists. Tesla's notes are in the Smithsonian. The atmospheric transmission experiments are documented. The science, if it was real, and his contemporaries treated it as real, has not been refuted. It has simply been unfunded. The FAO report on genetic diversity loss sits on a server, publicly available. The Archivo General de Indias is open to researchers. The Vatican restriction on those particular colonial-era medical documents lifts in 2048. That is 22 years from now. Whatever is in them, someone decided 22 years was the appropriate waiting period. I want to be clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying there is a single coordinating conspiracy spanning millennia. I am not saying ancient civilizations were more advanced than modern ones in every domain. I am not saying the official histories are wrong about the mechanics of collapse. What I am saying is that when you map the transitions, when you look not at what was lost but at what was gained, and specifically at who gained control of the replacement systems, the pattern is so consistent that it demands explanation. Not acceptance. Explanation. The 7 technologies I have described were not lost. Some were abandoned because they could not be owned. Some were actively destroyed because they empowered people who could not be administered. Some were never developed because the capital that funds development flows toward products, not commons. And the world we inherited, the world of meters and licenses and patents and toll points, is not the inevitable outcome of technological progress. It is one outcome, chosen structurally, repeatedly, over alternatives that are still sitting in archives and in the ground and in the practices of communities that never quite forgot. The archive still exists. The knowledge hasn't entirely gone. The patterns are buried in plain sight, in filing cabinets in Seville, in restricted folders with 2048 printed on them, in the maintenance records of water systems nobody built because they couldn't figure out how to charge for the rain. I don't have answers, only patterns. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them.